Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Ivan Fadeev. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute of World History of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And I'm privileged to welcome you all to this, our event, which is a fruit of active collaboration among several institutions. Firstly, it is our own Center for the Study of the History of Religion and Church History at the Institute of World History of Russian Academy of Sciences. Secondly, our academic partners in crime, namely the Pravorsky Research Medical University and the State Academic University for the Humanities. And thirdly, our ecclesiastical partner, the Synod Bioethics Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church. Just some housekeeping remarks. Please make sure that during the entire lecture, your microphones are switched off. We don't want unnecessary interventions or troubles. Just in order to make sure that you can hear everyone, it might serve you well if you switch off your video as well, but again, it's up to you. So in terms of the general outline of our meeting tonight, first I'll introduce our lecturer. Then he'll have the floor for the next 60 minutes. Then after that, the discussants will be introduced, and each of them is going to make his remarks within, let's say, a 10-15 minute limit. Then my colleague, Nadezhda Belikova, whom I'm going to introduce a bit later, is going to take the reins and open our Q&A session. And after the Q&A session, we will move into general discussion. So our distinguished lecturer tonight is Dr. Fabian Winiger, MS in medical anthropology, which he earned from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in medical anthropology from Hong Kong University. He's a senior research fellow at the Professorship for Spiritual Care at the University of Zürich. He is a co-author of the most recent volume, The Spirit of Global Health, the World Health Organization and the Spiritual Dimension of Health, 1946-2021. And today he is going to talk to us of covenants, polarizers and cosmopietists, global health and the post-secular turn in the United Nations. Professor Winiger, welcome. Thank you for your time. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you. It's not very often that we get to speak across these academic and cultural and geopolitical divides that we have these days. And so it's always a very distinct pleasure to speak to colleagues all over the world, and in this case in Russia. So yeah, it's an honor to see so many of you, and I look forward to meeting you. Perhaps later on we can turn on some of the videos as well, so I can see your faces, but for now you'll be seeing mine. So yeah, again, I'm Fabian. and I'll be speaking about the World Health Organization. So before I start with this, a bit of background on this project. This was a 3-year research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation on the WHO, and it concluded recently quite successfully, I think. And we have now a follow-up project on this, looking at spirituality and health in the wider United Nations system, because the WHO, of course, is just one actor in the UN system which deals with health. There are also other ones. Right now, I'm looking at the Refugee Agency. So this is my current project. And this are the findings of this WHO research, and they will be published this year. And we've already heard the name of the publication. It will be open access. And in the meantime, there is also a BMJ article just summarizing some of the key points. So much the background to this research project. And I'm now sharing my screen. Can you all see this well? Great.
Yes.
So yeah, this talk is really about a bridge between the medical profession and the spiritual view of life. So more broadly, you could say it is about the bridge, the relationship between a very highly secular organization, institution, and the religious communities. WHO, of course, is, we should admit that, is a very secular organization. And the medical institutions generally are highly secularized in most countries. And what we showed with this project was that the spiritual dimension of health within medical institutions, and in particular within WHO, is not just about palliative care. Yeah. So there is a broad perception that spirituality is relevant, maybe at the end of life. When you die, you think about God, but before that, it's not that relevant. So what we tried to do with this project is kind of argue with this a little bit. And we showed that actually the spiritual dimension of health has quite a long and complex history in the World Health Organization, which is practically unknown. And the WHO, of course, has a lot of influence in the national ministries of health, and they refer to WHO policy. But almost always they refer to WHO guidelines and so on without really knowing what was behind, what actually was behind these documents when they were created, what considerations went into them. And so we try to also look at the history, how did WHO come to be interested in spirituality at various times in history. And the WHO, again, like many other very prestigious medical institutions, produces a kind of secular aura, this kind of secular sphere, and very carefully guards it. It very carefully guards its secular scientific reputation on the one hand. But on the other hand, it also has what has been called a quote-unquote latent religious logic. And what is meant by that is that a lot of things that WHO and global health institutions generally do is not that different from what religious actors also do or try to do. So there is a kind of convergence there in motives and in goals. And one thing to illustrate that is the Director General, Halfdan Mahler, between 1973 and 1988. He was the Director General of WHO during some of the most important events in recent history of WHO. And he launched the Health for All initiative in what was then the Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan. And in his speeches, Halfdan Mahler really called this launch of the Health for All initiative a sacred moment. I quote, sacred moment. He also called it a spiritual and intellectual awakening. He also spoke of WHO as a temple of health, again, a quote, and universal primary health care, again, quote, the gospel of health for all. So we can see that at least one director general, a very influential one, was really recognized that WHO is not really alien to religious ways of thinking and what faith-based organizations try to do. There's a lot of overlap, so much so that they even describe WHO sometimes in religious terms. And again, global health in general, the whole global health field and discourse historically owes a lot to religious actors. And, not just historically, but still now, faith-based organizations do a lot of the heavy lifting, particularly in very rural and very poor rural communities. If there's a disaster, long after everyone else has left, it is often the faith-based actors which are still there, which are really committed. So they carry a lot of the global burden of health. At the same time, if you open a textbook on global health, you really rarely find a substantial discussion on this spiritual dimension of health. Very rarely. I mean, there may be a mention or something, but generally you don't really find anything about this, or it is presented as in problematic terms. And this is also curious because many of the pioneers of global health today, some of the most respected people, for example, Paul Farmer, were inspired at some point by spiritual experiences or had a spiritual background, maybe grew up in a Catholic family or something like that, which inspired them. Or Arthur Kleinman is another example. I'm sure you've heard of him. Also a very big figure, very well respected Harvard psychiatrist and medical anthropologist. And for him, he also has written in the past that there is a tendency in global health discourse to cloak religious values in a secular language. Yeah. And so this really is a dynamic which is not just limited to WHO, but it really applies to global health institutions in general. Yeah. There's this uneasy relationship, actually a lot going on behind the scenes, but it is not often talked about and not very well understood. So let me start with this, the case of the WHO. So I'll go on to the first slide here. And if we have a look at international health at the early 20th century, it's only since the 90s that we talk of global health. Back in the day, especially during the Cold War, international health was the term that was used. And in the early 20th century, the Health Office of the League of Nations, so that was the predecessor to the United Nations, was created. And then later in 1948, WHO was created. And in this time, so in the late 19th and early 20th century, medicine was changing very rapidly. And there were a lot of doctors who were trained in an older Hippocratic tradition. So a tradition where you have a relationship with a patient at the bedside is very humanistic. It was a different way, not primarily as a scientist. And so people trained in this Hippocratic tradition were being replaced by doctors trained in laboratory-based medicine. So scientists. And the reduction of this patient as a whole human being, to a biochemical phenomenon really caused a backlash or consternation among doctors who felt that something was going missing, right? Something was going missing. So there was this kind of reaction to the rise of laboratory-based medicine in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there was also another movement around the time, and that was the recognition of the international nature of public health. And there were many reasons for that. One was many waves of cholera, which threatened Europe and which threatened its colonies. There was also later the rise of air travel, the atomic bomb, and the development also of socialist medicine in the Soviet Union. So there were different factors which caused, the intelligentsia, the public health diplomats, and historians and doctors to rethink health as something which is very international. And a third kind of intellectual current was political holism. And so this was developed, among others, by the South African statesman, and I should say well-known racist, Jan Smuts. So Jan Smuts was very strongly influenced the League of Nations and also the United Nations. And he developed a holistic, he connected political holism with the United Nations. And this also had some impact on the founding of the WHO. So it was in this context that WHO was founded, and it was given a preamble to the Constitution, to its Constitution. And this preamble contained what is now called the definition of health. I'm not sure if it was a formal definition, but it stated that health is, and I quote, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. And so in this definition of health, we can see many of the movements of the time reflected. So health as something holistic, something which was more than just the body, right? And it was in this moment as well, in the first hour of the first World Health Assembly. So you see on the left the picture here, the first World Health Assembly on the 24th of June 1948. So this is basically the parliament of the World Health Organization. And in this moment, in the first hour, really, there was a speech given by a federal councillor of Switzerland. He was invited because Switzerland was hosting this World Health Organization. He, in the very first hour of the WHO's founding, he said, you know, hang on a second, there's something missing in this definition. There really should be a spiritual dimension as well. So it's very interesting that literally in the first hour of the founding of the WHO, someone said, you guys forgot something there. And it was acknowledged, you know, it was someone pointed it out. And for 30 years, about almost nothing happened. So for the first 30 years following the founding of WHO, spirituality almost never gained any attention by WHO staff. Instead, you know, the language of human rights was used. And a reason for that is, I think, was a conflict between the Catholic Church and the WHO's first Director General. His name was Brock Chisholm, over population control policy. So there was a kind of more or less open feud between Brock Chisholm and the Catholic Church. He was Canadian, over this issue. And I guess this factored into as well why religion wasn't really a topic, even though it was acknowledged in the first moment. So yeah, on this slide, again, you see on the left is the first World Health Assembly. On the right, you see the preamble with this very wide definition of health. And moving on to the next slide here. And here you see the first time that a spiritual dimension became a topic in the World Health Organization. And I'm saying spiritual dimension because this is the phrase that was used. So this is the 36th and 37th World Health Assemblies. Again, the World Health Assemblies is kind of the parliament, if you will, of the World Health Organization. And these were held in the early 80s, in 83 and 84. And this was also the time that Halfdan Mahler was the Director General. And at this time, WHO, which is a very short walk away from the headquarters of the World Council of Churches, WHO engaged in a series of exchanges with the Christian Medical Commission. And the Christian Medical Commission was set up by the World Council of Churches to carry out medical work in the global south. And Halfdan Mahler himself was a son of a pastor and was a close acquaintance with the first director of the Christian Medical Commission. And Mahler was very impressed by the work of this commission, and he began to explore with the leaders of the Christian Medical Commission the possibilities of cooperating in some ways. And they formed a joint standing committee. And this resulted in the formulation of the key principles of what would later become the primary healthcare paradigm. So the primary healthcare paradigm was formally launched. Well, it was developed in the 70s and was really reached global consensus with the Alma Ata conference in 1978. You see the poster there on the left. So the sacred moment that Mahler called it. So the creation of primary healthcare, at the very beginning of thinking about primary healthcare, there was this exchange with the Christian Medical Commission and with Halfdan Mahler. So you could argue that what we now take for granted, which is primary healthcare, was in its very beginning very much influenced by Christian actors. And this really began to take another turn in the 80s when the Christian medical commissions and representatives from India, from Africa, and especially from the Eastern Mediterranean regions began to argue in the executive board and in the World Health Assembly that this primary health care should also include a spiritual dimension of health, right? So, I mean, it was inspired by it. It seems kind of obvious that maybe it should also be formally acknowledged to be relevant in some way to spirituality. And this proposition was supported by members of the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement was a coalition of global South countries, recently decolonized countries, many of them, which at least formally was neither associated with the East Bloc nor the West Bloc, yeah? And hence the name non-aligned. And these former colonial states, many of them supported this proposal to include a spiritual dimension of health into this Health for All initiative. And they succeeded. They succeeded to vote through an unbinding invitation. I mean, it's an unbinding invitation. It was a very weak language, but still, it was a breakthrough. The World Health Assembly passed a resolution to recommend to invite member states to add a spiritual dimension to their health programs, and I quote, in accordance with their social and cultural patterns. And so you might say, okay, this was just this Health for All initiative. It was in the 80s. It was just an unbinding invitation. But the fact that this succeeded at all in the World Health Organization is really quite astounding. And not only is it quite astounding, but it's also almost unknown today. Yeah, I mean, of course, scholars working in the field, yes, they know it, you know. But outside of specialists or maybe people who've done, you know, some research on it, no one really knows about this. Now, if we look at this, so there was this recommendation that there was an invitation to consider spirituality. Now, the WHO's Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office, or for short EMRO, really had the strongest interest in this spiritual dimension. There was also the Southeast Regional Office, Sierra, I pronounce it, and the Western Pacific Regional Office. And they also occasionally referred to this, but by far the most activity occurred at EMRO. And in this Eastern Mediterranean region, spirituality in the 1980s, this invitation was really taken up, and spirituality began to figure as a way to gain support for public health measures, among others, a campaign against tobacco use, quite a successful campaign against tobacco use. And in 1989, this culminated in the Amman Declaration on Islamic Lifestyles. So this was, you see this on the right, this image of that book. And this provided very detailed guidelines for behavior, which were based on sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So again, it's quite unusual. I mean, yes, it's a regional office of the WHO. They have some autonomy. It doesn't apply to other regional offices, but still, that WHO regional offices of WHO released behavior guidelines for or recommendations for behavior, which were based on the religious prophet, is I think quite remarkable. Now, on the left as well, you see something more recent. This is from the 2021 month of Ramadan. And you see that until now, MRO is cooperating. And there were actually several instances of cooperating, which we've described in this research. And just to make a point, to jump from the Amman Declaration to today, you can see there has actually been quite consistent collaboration. Excuse me. So the problem, however, with the spiritual dimension of health in the EMRO was evident in the initial World Health Assembly discussions, and that was that it pitched a spiritual Islamic worldview against a quote-unquote materialistic American-led imperial order. So it wasn't entirely unproblematic. In some cases, it was used to make a geopolitical points as well. So by saying that, by basically saying that the existing political world order was materialistic, but we are spiritual and therefore superior in some way. And this kind of language you already saw in the early 1980s, and throughout the 80s, there were occasionally this kind of language was surfaced. And sometimes also it became a pretext for a very conservative and also a very homophobic morality, which I don't think was the intention of the spiritual dimension originally in the World Health Assembly. Now, I'll jump to the next instance when the spiritual dimension was relevant. And that concerns, it's something of a side story, but it's still relevant. It concerns how WHO saw and sees what it calls traditional medicine. And in the early 1970s, WHO became interested in traditional medicine because it hoped that it would provide, and I quote, manpower needed for primary healthcare reform in developing countries. Because of course, universal primary healthcare requires a lot of people, a lot of trained staff. It was expensive. And there just were not enough medical professionals around. So traditional medicine, practitioners of traditional medicine, so local healers, local priests, local religious experts, and so on, also often had some medical knowledge or could be trained to do some simple things. And through that way of thinking, spirituality also occurred occasionally. And again, this was also partly inspired by the Christian Medical Commission. You see in the middle here, Contact. It was a magazine which was sent, was named Contact because it was sometimes the only way of contacting, very remote missionary outposts. And Contact magazine, here you see it is titling Rediscovering an Ancient Resource. So the CMC acknowledged this role played by local healers, and also the Chinese barefoot doctors also provide an inspiration, because at that time Chinese regime experimented with barefoot doctors. So these were traditional practitioners trained with some biomedical knowledge, and this really deeply impressed some delegations to the People's Republic of China. And this also inspired WHO to take seriously local healers, even though, it was this complication with their spiritual beliefs. And it was also advocated by newly decolonized nations who felt that their local medical traditions could contribute to cultural and economic independence. And also, of course, that their spirituality in the way could serve help their strive for independence. Yeah. And then in the 1990s, herbal remedies were beginning to be mass produced. It became a huge industry in Africa and Asia. And in each of these contexts, WHO had to deal with this spiritual aspect because traditional medicine, is very, very often deeply embedded in spiritual practices and spiritual beliefs. And it had to in some way address that. And so it tended to ignore it. Sometimes it was, could commodify it. In any case, it was something WHO had to deal with. The next topic is probably the most well-known, so I'll just briefly talk about it, which is palliative care. And it is noticeable that despite this largely uncontested recognition of spirituality in palliative care, most WHO documents mention it without really elaborating on it. So starting in the mid to late 80s, WHO really started to take seriously palliative care, and spirituality was featured there, but it wasn't really clear what exactly it entailed, what exactly was meant by this. But it was acknowledged that when you die, God becomes important, and on that level, it wasn't really controversial. And there was a historical coincidence at the time that WHO began to take seriously palliative care, just as HIV was also accelerating its spread. And this led to this kind of mutual validation where, to the extent that the new palliative care approach was recognized as appropriate for HIV victims, it also seemed plausible that WHO had to contain a palliative component, and which, as I said, included a spiritual dimension. So spirituality in some way benefit is a bad word, but piggybacked, on this acknowledgement of palliative care, which in turn was quite relevant because AIDS had such a high mortality rate initially. Now, one of the most interesting episodes happened in the mid to late 1990s when the WHO's Division of Mental Health developed a scale for the assessment of quality of life. And this was quite a innovative scale for different reasons. The WHO, as it's called, WHO Quality of Life instrument, was developed through a very broad systematic consultation across different cultural settings. So it was very intercultural in that way, and also it measured subjective well-being rather than functional normality of the person. And it also allowed people to express whether or not a certain thing which was being measured was important to them, right? So the weighing of an item was also introduced here. So the WHO call was it was quite a big project, and sometimes after the WHO call was created, they developed a module which also assessed spirituality, personal and religious beliefs, so SRPB. And you see on the right-hand side, the WHO call SRPB module. Yeah, so this was an extension to this quality of life instrument, which specifically looked at spirituality, religious, and personal beliefs. On the left-hand side, you see an advertisement for recruiting participants to volunteers for discussion groups to inform this. So these were held all over the world. So they were being discussion groups to create this questionnaire with volunteers that was being held all over the world. But this advertising here is from Bath in the UK. And in the development of this module, researchers applied the same kind of rigorous cross-cultural consultation that marked the Hukol, but this time they brought together religious experts who sought to find commonalities across theological questions. So it was quite interesting how WHO used this approach that they developed and applied it to theological questions. And the result is actually surprisingly good. I mean, it's really, there are many of these kinds of instruments to measure the relationship between health and religion and or well-being and religion. And the Hukol is, in my opinion, a very strong one. So the next episode was in the late 1990s, there was at the 101st Executive Board meeting, there was a very brief and failed attempt to make spirituality a priority for all WHO activities by directly adding the term spiritual to the mental and social aspects, which are mentioned in the definition of health, which is in the preamble of the WHO's constitution. And the Executive Board, again, initially agreed to this, but at the World Health Assembly, this did not pass. This was not voted through. And on this occasion, it was backed again by several Islamic majority member states, and also Argentina, the Cook Islands, the United Kingdom, and Ireland were also in support at that time. Now, if we look at the new millennium, so after the year 2000, the religion really became more recognized in the United Nations. And within WHO, this was reflected in an attempt to forge closer collaborations with civil society through consultation with non-governmental organizations and also faith-based non-governmental organizations, so-called FBOs. And so there are a few moments in this history in the past 20 years where in 2003, the HIV/AIDS department employed an episcopal priest as a partnerships officer to build a closer relationship with religious actors. In 2005, WHO contracted a major study to be conducted by the African Religious Health Assets Program. This was also in the battle against HIV/AIDS in Africa. And in 2009, there was a big 6-day conference on health and lifestyle, which was organized by a group of Seventh-day Adventists. And it was attended by over 600 members of this church and also representatives from WHO. And there was even a reception in the meeting room of the executive board at the headquarters in Geneva. But this was all moving a little bit too fast for WHO, and there was very strong opposition from former WHO staff members and current WHO staff members who were very concerned about the involvement of religious actors in secular affairs, and interrupted this plan, and really placed this kind of collaboration which was intended there, placed this on hold. So there was a bit of a difficult situation. And since then, cooperation between WHO and religious communities has been quite not really systematic, mostly as part of the polio eradication program in Pakistan, Somalia, Nigeria, Afghanistan, during the West African Ebola crisis. And most recently, the WHO's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has again really brought attention to religious actors. But by and large, you could say that WHO has really been very slow, because in the past 20 years in the United Nations, there have been many different agencies who have built very strong partnerships with faith-based organizations. So the few things that I've mentioned here are kind of pale in comparison, you could say. So just to refer to the images you can see here, on the left, you see building from common foundations, faith FBOs in primary healthcare. This was the driving force behind this was this episcopal priest, which departed WHO later on, and it wasn't very easy, this relationship. So this is not really referred to so much. And this was about religious health assets. This was in 2009. And on the right-hand side, you see take a screenshot from the guidelines on how to give dignified burials to victims of Ebola in West Africa. So you can see here again, this is intended to consider the needs of religious communities. Now, this is what I would like to say about the WHO. I would like to now, with the remaining 5 minutes of my talk, maybe I go a few minutes over time, but I would like to now talk about the larger theoretical issue which is at stake here. So I'll go to the next slide, and this is really this post-secular turn in multilateralism. So this is something, there's a lot of literature on this by now, but it's something which has really started in the last 20 years. You could even say in the last 10 to 15 years in some cases. And it is something which has happened it is discussed in different literatures, in different disciplines. So international relations theory, for example, deals with this. The development literature deals with this. The global health literature deals with this. So there is a fairly widespread recognition now that something has changed in how multilateral organizations view religious communities. And I would like to start with a first kind of key point in what has changed in this thinking. And I refer here to Baumgarten, Ochsen, Wolf. You can see this is 2009, so it is still, by social science standards, very, very, very new publication. So in 2009 this was. And what we see on what they argue as well is that religious actors were very often ignored and left out of institutional processes because they were seen to have strong and highly divisive opinions, and especially on gender, on sexuality, and on reproductive rights. And in the past 20 years, many UN agencies have begun to understand that religious actors, yes, they can be very problematic, but you could argue that even more problematic is ignoring them. And of course, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 is one example where religion comes knock on your doorstep, right? So the number of accredited religious NGOs, so FBOs in the UN, almost doubled in the first decade of the new millennium. And the World Health Organization, has been, as I said, somewhat slow in this trend. And one reason for this is that religious actors are often invisible, even though they contribute enormous resources to global health. I mean, there are some religious groups that have, dozens or hundreds of hospitals and clinics and things like that. So they're invisible, even though they contribute enormous resources. So there has been literature and different intersectoral collaborations. For example, a joint learning initiative on faith and local communities as one example, or more recently the PARD, Partnership on Religion Development, which has started to make them visible. Yeah, and so there has also started to develop a recognition that religious actors, yes, they can be polarizers, but they can also be mediators. And you can see this, for example, in the field of climate change advocacy. You can see it in the field of refugee protection, or in the International Criminal Court. In the International Criminal Court, for example, religious actors have in the past advocated for reconciliation instead of punishment. Yeah. So yes, some religious communities can be extremely polarizing, especially with regard to gender issues, but they can also build bridges and be mediators. And this has become more recognized in the past 10 to 20 years. So we are now, as I said, at a point which can be described as a post-secular terms in terms of how many UN organizations perceive religious actors. And so now that this recognition is more widely shared, the question arises of how can we cooperate with the religious actors? And so I want to move beyond the WHO and talk about a couple of theoretical models which have been developed in recent years to think about this larger question of religion in multilateral organizations. And the first, you see them here on this slide, the first one here is the idea of covenantal pluralism. So this is a bit of a strange word. It was developed by a group of people who bring together many, many decades of experience at the highest level of government and academia, primarily in the United States. And this kind of pluralism refers to the obvious fact that we live in a world of many different nations, many different religions, ethnicities, ideologies, and so on. Covenantal refers to a way of doing this which is based on profound mutual understanding. And to put it very briefly, covenantal pluralism is about a social contract which is based in religious virtues. So to make it more than, this makes it more than a normal social contract. It makes it a covenant. You could say a contract between yourself and other people in relation to something transcendental. It is a covenant based on profound, theologically founded mutual respect. So to differentiate this from a regular social contract, right? What is respect? So in this model, respect is about trust. It's about trust in and acceptance of people in their difference and the appreciation of what makes them different. So covenantal pluralism is an alternative to, let's say, regular pluralism, which this theory argues is based on basically pretending that we agree with other people's beliefs, or saying that deep down we all believe the same or we all believe similar things. So it is an alternative to a social contract based on quote unquote tolerating other people's belief. And you often hear about different interfaith initiatives, and they're very beautiful. I love these kind of things. At the same time, covenantal pluralism argues that maybe we should be in favor of multi-faith, not interfaith pluralism. It argues that we should integrate people who are different, integrate them, not assimilate them. So welcome them without expecting them to be like us or without having to agree with them. So in short, you could say, these are my words, it is about the dignity of difference. It is about being indifference in dignity. And if we look at the United Nations system, there are some organizations, and again, the UNHCR, the refugee agency, have in recent years moved in this direction. At the same time is the interfaith approach to pluralism, I think, very strongly represented in the UN. In fact, there is at least one UN agency which only wants to engage with interfaith communities. So the other model here is that of cosmopietism. And you could say it is in some way similar to covenantal pluralism. It basically states that we should extend our religious duty beyond our own community and to the entire planet. And a historical example of this is the Jewish tradition of giving a 10% tithe, a tax, for the benefit of all people who live in the walls of a city. And many religions have a similar teaching, which asks that we look after people outside our own community, just like we look after people inside our communities. So maybe you can think of your own religious tradition. if you can find this kind of teaching. It is quite common. In today's cosmopolitan world, this would imply a duty of religious communities to contribute, for example, to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which can be seen as a tithe, not for all citizens of a city, but to the whole world. It is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They benefit all people, not just our own community. And we should commit to that in the same way we commit to our own community. And it is no coincidence that many religious actors in the UN today are very strong proponents of the Sustainable Development Goals and develop a lot of resources to achieving them. Now, cosmopietism also asks something in return. And what it asks is that religious actors are a valued part of institutions, even though they may hold opposing views. And so in my reading, this goes a step further than covenantal pluralism, which simply respects difference. Cosmopietism depends on what is called, and I quote, loyal opposition. And there are many historical examples of loyal opposition. Kant's proposal for perpetual peace, parliamentary democracy, the Jewish tradition of debating the Talmud, and even what we are doing now, what we're going to be doing after I finish talking is academic or scientific exchange. All these are forms of loyal opposition, you could argue. And it's loyal because we need to agree with each other. We need to disagree with each other to have a healthy society. So we are showing loyalty by disagreeing and sometimes even dissenting. So most faith-based NGOs, FBOs in the UN, may be described as cosmopietists in the sense that they work for the good of humanity as if it was their own faith community, or at least they claim to do so, but they insist on participating on the basis of loyal opposition. But globally, I think this cosmopietist way of thinking is a small minority, and certainly outside the United Nations, outside this quite small handful of organizations which is accredited with the United Nations, religious nationalism and identity politics is a far more prevalent than this cosmopietism. So this brings me to my last slide. And I want to return to my point that in the WHO, people, for the most part of this history, has used this term spirituality, not religion. So a religious dimension of health would have been unthinkable in WHO in most historical episodes which we looked at. It changed during the corona pandemic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen WHO move beyond the term spiritual and really towards embracing religious actors through in their own language of religion and in their own identification. So this kind of pluralism that I've described before. But for most of the history of WHO, they have used this word spirituality. And I think one reason for this is very simple. And this is, it is the word religion. There's the problem. Because as we all know, this word religion brings up many connotations for people, and they can be very strong, usually imply systemic problems. People think of violence, corruption, populism, conservatism, patriarchy. So for historical reasons, religion in popular usage has become something of an antithesis to modern, equitable, cosmopolitan, global civil society, right? And now spirituality has much less historical baggage. You don't hear about spiritual fundamentalists in the news, right? They're always religious fundamentalists. So of course, so it seems to have less historical baggage, but of course, ironically, spiritual experience is at the core of religious life. So spirituality is a very flexible diplomatic term. It can be enriched or thinned depending on who's listening, on who you're speaking to. And it also lends itself to this horizontal model of faith engagement, to this interfaith model, which is established in the United Nations in recent years because it looks for commonality, right? It is a common denominator. It doesn't matter if you're Hindu or Russian Orthodox or Sikh or Buddhist, you probably agree spirituality is very important to you and you can exchange on a meaningful level about it. So in this sense, spirituality is works quite well with this interfaith way of engaging with religious actors. And in WHO, spirituality has succeeded to a certain extent to build a bridge between religious communities and secular ideology. Yeah. And we could argue that it is not a solution because, it marginalizes the full expression of religion. So I'm not sure if this is really the future. But we also see WHO moving towards religious actors on the basis of cosmopietist or covenantal pluralism, building on its familiarity with the religious actors through this term spirituality. And this is really what I think we have been seeing in the COVID-19 pandemic. So, so much from myself. I've gone a bit over time. I hope it's been interesting. Thank you very much for listening. And I will now listen to you and take your notes.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for this absolutely delightful lecture. Well, as a non-specialist, I find it to be incredibly interesting. Colleagues, it's time for us to move into a preliminary discussion. To that end, I would love to introduce our discussion participants first. So we have here our good friend and colleague, Dr. Natalia Schock, who is a professor at a medical university. She holds a doctorate in the history of medicine and a PhD in political sciences. She is a well-known specialist in bioethics. Currently, she works on a social history of medicine and religion, bioethics and Soviet history of medicine, international relations and history of medicine during the Cold War, and the questions of global bioethics. Our second participant is Dr. Nikolai Sapirkin, an associate professor at the Department of Epidemiology of Privolzhsky Research Medical University. He holds also his master's degree in clinical epidemiology from the University of Utrecht. He is interested in problems of healthcare associated infections and changing antibacterial resistance of microorganisms. Fascinating, although I don't understand what it's all about, but I'm sure he will tell us something about that as well. Our next participant, discussant, is of course Archpriest Alexander Abramov, the secretary to the Synod Bioethics Committee. He is, of course, a graduate of the Faculty of History of Lomonosov Moscow State University. In 2003-2010, he was a representative of the Russian Orthodox Church in the United States. And since 2005, he has been a representative of the World Russian People's Council to the UN. He served as an expert in the delegations of the Russian Federation to the 61st, 64th sessions of the UN General Assembly and its specialized agencies. And the last but not the least, and in my mind, the most important participant, as well as a driving force behind this event tonight, is a good friend of mine and colleague, Dr. Nadezhda Belyakova, a senior research fellow at the Institute of World History of the Russian Academy of Sciences. She is an internationally well-known church historian, specializing in the history of a religious factor in and during the Cold War, and she is particularly interested in women in the history of Christianity. But it's again just one of many topics that she is a well-regarded specialist in. So these are our discussants, and I'm now giving the reins over to Dr. Nadezhda Belyakova, who is going to moderate the Q&A session, our preliminary discussion, and then the general discussion as well. Nadezhda, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And now is the time to let Archpriest Alexander Abramov talk. I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you, Fabian, for your lecture, which enriches me personally, particularly on the historical part of the discussion. I'm speaking now in my personal capacity, not as an official of the Russian Orthodox Church, but primarily as the former vice president of religious NGOs at the UN headquarters, and also the member of the Russian governmental delegation to the UN. Just several facts to add to what you've told us before. We've been witnessing a drastic growth of non-governmental organizations' presence at the UN. At the moment, we have more than, I'd say, 6,000 NGOs in various statuses at the UN. As you know, but it would be useful to remind to those who could possibly use that knowledge, we have several forms of consultative statuses at the Economic and Social Council of the UN, at the DPI, which is Department of Public Information, at the headquarters, also to UNESCO, and to the headquarters in Geneva. Those NGOs are opted out by the decision of the member states. And the reviewing process is underway each year. None of these organizations at the time of their enrollment say we are FBOs, which is faith-based organizations. They say, we are going to work on this and that task and cooperate with the UN on this and that task. And health is among the tasks. It's not only the issue, but the process as well. As we remember in Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, struggling with several diseases was among the major 8. And among the major 8 is when MDGs, as many people say, failed by year 2015, the health tasks, prevention of several diseases, was also under strong criticism. Now, WHO is not the only UN agency dealing with the health problems. along with the refugees officers. I'd like to remind of UNFPA, UNDP, many others. Of specific interest is UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, organized after high-level segment on religious discussions, 2007. Also, UN Strategic Learning Exchanges on Religion, Development, Diplomacy, which is underway at the moment. My personal impression as the religious practitioner, not an academic, and the priest, and then governmental official in years 2007 to 2009, we have serious problems with the perception of religious presentation at the United Nations. And I would like to name just a few of them. First, the character of relationship between FBOs, faith-based NGOs, and almost any agency at the UN is primarily accidental. It may happen, and it also may not happen, depending on the position of the leadership of the agencies. Secondly, it's almost in none way connected with the position of the member states. The fact of very existence of the member states is often omitted. In your lecture, you said things like that. WHO is interested in spirituality, so it also may not be interested in spirituality, depending on its own wish. Or, for instance, naturally, WHO is highly secular. I am not terribly convinced it's naturally highly secular. What about the position of the member states? Is OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference, highly secular? I just want you to remind, as an anecdote, a case happening with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, at the UN headquarters some 10 to 7 years ago. He was forbidden to smoke at the UN premises on the grounds that it's not allowed to smoke at the UN building. And then he reacted extremely angrily. He said, we hire these people. They work for the member states, not vice versa. And that should be remembered as well. Secondly, we deal with a huge amount of the red tape at almost any UN office. And this red tape tends to grow up. And their importance and their influence is not to be diminished unless the member states deal with that. One thing more. In the French colonial system, there was a term, évoluer. Évoluer, or developed, close to be developed, rather, are the people of the colonies who almost developed to the level they could be brought to metropole to show how high the metropolitan civilization is. And this implied concept of évoluers, although it's not said that way, it's not put that way, predominates the approaches of many agencies, including WHO. For example, You showed us the picture with the local healers. That's from WHO guide of year 2007. Local healers are at the bottom. They are community level. They should be trained. And that includes the vision of them as undertrained, not fully ready to be instrumental in ensuring healthcare. So who will be training them? Those who are already in possession of super knowledge, I would say. That kind of super knowledge presumes lots of things which are not to be presumed. Now, and that's, by the way, I believe is a serious vice, not defect, but vice of the United Nations system. Since United Nations, after League of Nations, and especially after the Second World War, was a romantic organization. It was very hard not to be romantic and not to be spiritual in terms of view after the Second World War. The same aspires and aspired WMA, World Medical Association, at the same time, working on its declaration. In the meantime, red tape and hypocrisy, in my opinion, changed a lot. And the question is, as I see the situation, is not whether this or that agency or this or that FBO will be cosmopoetic or loyal opportunist. The question is the same as in American Civil War. No taxation without representation. So the relationship between the FBOs, between the religious community should be, first of all, institutional, not the question of whether we would like to have that or not. It should be institutional. If it is institutional, as many countries suggested at different levels, including General Assembly, lots of questions will be immediately resolved, including what problems are to be financed and what problems are not to be, what programs are to be financed and what programs are not to be financed. What are the objections of FBOs and what they do agree to include into consideration. Finally, I'd like to quote American Heritage Dictionary. Faith-based diplomacy is a key resource to be used at the opportune moment. The key words, opportune moment. So you may wish to include that key resource in your game or not. Until now, UN system in its integrity shows how it fails to continue being a community of nations. That's the general point. What could be done is taking any actor, including FBOs, seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think, thank you for your burning question and view from point of view of religious organization. And maybe Dr. Winiger will answer now to these remarks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for these comments. I've taken a lot of notes, and it's rare to receive such detailed and competent feedback on this topic, because there's not that many people working on it. So thank you very much. I could hear that you have been involved in this field for many years, and I can certainly benefit from your experience in this. So I try to just pick up a few points. I don't think I can really give justice to all the points that you've raised, but I like to just address a few of them. So first of all, yes, I think it's important, you're right, to distinguish between the different consultative statuses. So there's a very formal and bureaucratic mechanisms for NGOs to associate with different parts of the UN, and they all differ. They all differ in what it allows an NGO to do, and there is no distinction at as far as I know at the moment of accreditation regarding their faith status. So it is not. It actually has to be manually found out, so to speak. And scholars have done that, to manually go and see which ones of these are actually faith-based. So it's important to distinguish that, it makes a difference whether an NGO is ECOSOC accredited, which is much easier, or at the headquarters, or with an individual agency, and so on. So that's an important distinction. The other one as well, which I've mentioned, is WHO is really just one organization which is dealing with health, and leading the engagement with the religious actors has been UNFPA and UNAIDS, right? And World Bank, surprisingly, as well. Not so much in terms of health, but they've also done some a bit longer ago, but they also did some very important work on relationships with faith, the World Bank. However, now it is there's this interagency task force, which was launched in 2007 by UNFPA, and they have released a report every year, summarizing in a lot of detail what has been done in terms of relationships with religious communities. So yes, I think that is very important to emphasize. Now, in terms of the serious problems, first of all, you mentioned that the character of relationships between FBOs and almost any agency is primarily accidental, right? Or you could say incidental to what an FBO can offer, so to speak. And moreover, that this depends on the leadership, right? So if there is a leader, such as Antonio Guterres, who is now the Secretary General, when he happened to be Secretary of UNHCR, well, yes, then religions were interesting, but however, only as far as religions could kind of serve UNHCR. So that is an argument which could be made, and that really goes right to the core, I think, of the problem here, which is religious communities don't want to be instrumentalized, right? Religious communities do not want to be a second-rate kind of group which is just invited when it's convenient and useful, right? And I think this goes back to the point of respect, right? It's not really respect. I mean, it may be tolerance, it may be some limited inclusion or assimilation, but it is not really respect. I mean, it is not really community. So I agree that there is a kind of hypocrisy, you could say, if you talk about the community of nations and partnerships. However, it is all kind of limited to this instrumentalization. And there's a lot of religious leaders and communities who criticize, who make exactly that criticism, and who also don't want to engage with the United Nations because they don't want to be, instrumentalized. So I agree this is a core problematic, and one which I cannot solve, right? Now, WHO, you say, I said the WHO is interested in spirituality, and naturally WHO is highly secular. So it's true, I expressed this sentiment. Now, it's very difficult to speak of WHO as if it is one institution, because it is a huge institution, which is very complicated because it has 6 different regional offices, which they all do, their own independent things. Of course, they're part of the WHO, but they also have their own priorities. There's also a bit of tension between what Geneva wants and what regional offices want. So there is, different interest politics within WHO, even just at the executive level. Then WHO, unlike other UN agencies, has this kind of parliamentary system where you have member states debating things in the World Health Assembly. So even at the level of decision making, you have many different member states who have many different interests, and which may be completely opposite interests. I mean, so here as well, it's difficult to say WHO this, WHO that, right? I mean, you have to really specify who in WHO is saying what and when and in what context. However, in terms of saying WHO is highly secular, I can stand behind this, because WHO by and large is dominated by medical professionals or people who work, in the medical field in some ways, or are highly acculturated to this kind of medical world. And it is a highly secular medical world. I mean, of course, there are movements within medicine which may try to bring religious or spiritual values into medicine. But I think by and large, in terms of the elite, international, cosmopolitan medicine, that is a marginal movement at this point. So, yeah. Now, at the point you brought about Lavrov at the UN headquarters, who was forbidden to smoke. And I think this is a great example that, it is, I think the impression of the United Nations that I have as well is extremely bureaucratic. There's a lot of that is being said, and a lot of guidelines, and a lot of resolutions, and to some extent, this is just what's happening on the front stage, right? What everyone sees, but what is happening in the backstage may be very, very different story. And so myself as an academic don't really have such a deep insight into that as you yourself, having sat in many of these committees have. Right. But I think it is important to keep in mind, especially when we read, documents produced by WHO or any other UN agencies, that there's always a backstory, and this is kind of the tip of the iceberg. And so we can't take everything at face value, because, I mean, if you look how these documents happen, it may just be a very cynical thing. So we have to be very critical, as well. Now, on the point of the colonialism, the French colonial system, you mentioned the évoluer, or I hear it as the developed versus undeveloped world. And if I understand it correctly, this is basically the colonial legacy, right, of the United Nations. Who is the United Nations to just say you are developed, you're not developed, you need to be trained, you don't need to be trained? Who are they to define what is expertise, right? So and there are different authors on the beginning of the United Nations. There are some who have a very positive kind of romantic view. United Nations was a great thing, it happened, to create world peace. How beautiful is that? It was very hopeful, human rights discourse, all of that. And then there are other authors which argue and, very strong historically show that the United Nations in many ways has just been an extension of imperialism. Basically has been an attempt by the United Kingdom and also by the US to expand, or especially for the United Kingdom to retain its imperium, and that this was translated into United Nations. So very strong critique as well of United Nations, that it is not actually this beautiful kind of utopia, but actually it is basically a post-colonial or neo-colonial construct. So this as well, I'm not saying I support this view, that I endorse this view, but I think we have to take it very seriously, because we see it again with how religions are treated, right? In terms of how religions are treated, it is in some way colonial, because there is the secular institution, still, very Western in terms of Western, dominated by Western philosophy, and they can define the terms of engagement, and you have to be kind of compatible with that. And however, what I would like to say is that I think there are many people, scholars or practitioners in the UN system, who reflect on that and who self-criticize and who realize that how the United Nations deals with the religion is to a significant extent a colonial legacy. So I wanted to add that. And the last point is, I think, really sums up what I've just said and what you've said, is that this relationship should not be instrumental. It should be institutional, and it should not be something which happens at the opportune moment. And if this is the basis of engagement, it is hypocritical and not a community of nations. And so I absolutely agree with that. And the couple of theoretical models I proposed are maybe one way to move beyond that. So yeah, thank you very much for your very useful comments.
Thanks a lot.
Nadia, we do not hear you. Switched on the micro.
Oh, I'm very sorry. And now it's the time to let Dr. Nikolai Sapirkin talk. Please, are you here? Yes.
Yes, so I can hear you quite well. So first of all, good evening, dear colleagues. And thank you so much, Fabian, for your exciting presentation. And of course, good luck to you in all your projects. And we are waiting for your further publications. So maybe in Russian as well, why not? But so anyways, as an epidemiologist, first of all, I'd like to draw your attention to a fact that, for instance, COVID-19 is really a very strong example of how different social factors can facilitate and do facilitate the spread of an infectious disease in various communities. So even like pandemics. And of course, among all possible social factors, spirituality and how it can affect personal beliefs with regard to COVID-19, how it can influence the spread of COVID-19. And of course, as a physician, I want to believe that any kind of aids, any kind of means can help us to stop spreading the infection. And I wonder what could be the best practices or the best practices of religious leaders in order to develop a positive and critical attitude to COVID-19, as well as what kind of obstacles religious leaders could face with. And why I'm asking this question, because now I'd like to present here another funny story. And now it does not concern Sergei Lavrov. If my memory serves me right, last year in the city of Kazan, so for Fabian, Kazan is another large city in Russia. Of course, Nizhny Novgorod is better, but still Kazan is also beautiful. But anyways, last year in this city, they transported an Orthodox icon on a helicopter above the city in order to stop COVID-19 in this region. And I really hope that it doesn't have anything with spirituality and with all practices or all religious practices which could help us as epidemiologists, as physicians, to stop this catastrophe in Russia and all over the world. And of course, for me as an epidemiologist, this dimension of how one can look at such a serious problem could be. So it is really very interesting, and you give us a lot of room to think up concerning this problem. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Fabian, do you want to answer?
Yeah, just very briefly, maybe I can say your first point. Yeah, COVID-19 is I agree, very strong example of how different social factors can facilitate the spread of infectious disease. This has become, I think this has been well known by some people within WHO since the HIV/AIDS pandemic, with cholera. With the Ebola outbreak, it became a topic, and there were indeed guidelines created to how to bury people with dignity, because people were not burying their dead, because the infectious disease control teams came in without knowledge of the local religious beliefs, and people got very scared and did not bury their bodies or hid their bodies. So there was a kind of an aha moment, and there were guidelines created on how to how to have dignified burials, safe and dignified burials. With COVID-19, this really came to the next level, and I'm not sure you may be aware of this, but there's one particular community in the Eastern Orthodox Church where there has been some very, very high level individuals who did not acknowledge the existence of the virus and continued certain religious rituals, which are, have a very high, which are very, very problematic. And there were, in fact, many people who died, including several of the people of the senior leadership in that community at a national level. So, and you also mentioned the example of flying a cross, I assume, to combat the spread of the pandemic. So there's there's a very, very, and religious communities have a lot of reach. So if there's one religious leader having a certain opinion, there's a big chance that many people will follow that. They are leaders. And so WHO recognized that in early 2020 and started to respond to that and started the dialogue with over 60 different faith leaders. Together, I created guidelines, and in a very consultative, very eye level, very humble way of speaking with them. And over 2 years, they built up relationships with different religious communities to improve their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the result of that is a strategy paper on how to involve faith leaders, faith communities, and so on during health crises. So this is the first time now that WHO, through this pandemic, has developed a strategy on how to involve religious communities. So this is a breakthrough. So yeah, thank you for your question. And there has in fact been some development there. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Professor Natalia Shok, Professor of Privolzhsky Medical University.
Thank you so much. So Fabian, I'm very grateful to you for your fascinating presentation. And it's very important for Russian academic community to touch all bases that you've mentioned in your lecture. So it seems that it's really important and influential in terms of academic discussions and so further academic discussions. I would like just briefly to turn our discussions back to the academic debates, since we've discussed a lot of modern situations concerning WHO and UN agencies and its political implications towards healthcare. But what I found interesting for me, and this is the term spiritual that you used through your whole presentation several times, and it was mixed with the religious and religion as another term during your presentation. And another point, I would like just to have a more clear picture of how do you see this concept, spirituality and religion, was transformed from the early stages of its development within the system of international health, and through this historical dynamics within this system of global health. You've mentioned these points that first of all, we had this international health system, and then it turned to global health care. And now we have this COVID pandemic situation, which also changed the situation. But I wonder, my first impression when I met these two terms in my academic sphere of bioethics, it was connected within the bioethics and its development. And there are two different, let's say, groups of scholars who consider spirituality as a good term to convince people to make more plural discussions and more diverse of dialogue. And another group of people consider that spirituality is typically used to mark a domain of human experience that include this typical religious institutions, beliefs and myths and teachings and people. So there is a big tension in academic sphere between these two terms. And I'm interested, how do you define these terms first? And the second, how do you think spirituality and religion as a terms were developed during these transformations within the global health systems through the second half of 20th century and early stages of 21st century? So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia, for these questions. So first, I'll begin with the second one, the second question. How did these two terms, spirituality and religion, develop? So in WHO, the term spirituality was already used in the first hour of the first World Health Assembly, and up until and actually was the main term which was being used, throughout its history up until, with some exceptions, usually there was talk about spirituality, not religion or faith. And I think, yeah, there's many reasons for that. And one of them is just because it's a less strong word, which triggers people much less, and which sounds less like institutions, sounds less like, all the problems that come with institutionalized religion. It sounds more like a subjective thing, maybe related to well-being, related to a meaning in life. And these are things which are much more easily understandable through the lens of psychology or psychiatry, right? Whereas religion brings religious leaders and religious, written texts and all the negative things, which are much less associated. So I think for that reason in WHO, usually there was this term that was being used. It has been changing, as I said before. In terms of the global health discourse, or just the general use of these terms, spirituality as a term has a very interesting history. Most people probably think in the West or in Europe, in say in Switzerland and where in America, people think of spirituality as being somehow connected to the hippies, counterculture, New Age, alternative, subversive, kind of very subjective thing. But that's not the whole story. Spirituality has developed this term in other places. It's part of the Catholic faith as well, right? Catholic theology also has this term spirituality, uses this in different contexts. So in terms of health-related research, it was the 1990s when the spirituality really became a more widespread topic of investigation. And I would say within wider social sciences, I've seen in the last 5 or 10 years or so, I personally have noticed an increased interest in spirituality, which goes beyond spirituality as a new age or alternative religion thing and takes it quite seriously. And it's a very interesting topic. How I personally see spirituality, you know, it's I like to be kind of an observer. It's difficult for me to make a normative declaration of what spirituality should be. I'm an anthropologist, not a theologian, but I actually don't have a big problem with this distinction between religion and institution and spirituality as being, you know, more closer to experience. I don't think that is fundamentally problematic. Yes, you know, it is not perfect. Yes, there are many counterexamples, but by and large, the popular usage of it, it kind of makes sense to me. And keep in mind, I'm working at the Professorship of Spiritual Care. Here, it's not religious care. Mm-hmm. I've never heard of a Professorship of Religious Care, but there is one of spiritual care. And spiritual care is, you know, most hospitals have spiritual care provisions, you know, where chaplains and, you know, it's part of palliative care. With religious care, it's much more difficult. You don't really see much of that. So obviously it is doing something right. Somehow it is working. Of course, there are problems with it, but maybe you have some of them you can share.
Well, thank you, Fabian. My question was connected to the discussions within this community of American scholars who are developing this field on medicine and religion that we've mentioned before in our private discussions. So their concerns is about that spirituality will just exclude the religious perspective in terms of such traditional things for religion as medical ethics, as clinical medicine and clinical ethics. So their concerns are about this, but my question was more connected to the ideas what particular term could help more to the global health development in terms of current pandemic crisis and in terms of transformation of global health. I mean, you've mentioned very important events in the history of WHO and the development of a global health agenda. But in terms of last decades, let's say, global health transformed to the two directions, global health governance and global health security, as you probably heard. And in this, considering this, just it's interesting for me, how do you see the development of term spirituality in terms of this securitization of health and let's say more administrative approach to the global health developments? So this is the last remark, and thank you so much.
So shall I quickly reply to that, or? Also, yeah. just very briefly, I think there's two things that is, I guess, needed or would be helpful. One is epistemological, which is, you know, there needs to be, I think it would be helpful if United Nations agencies and, you know, key people in WHO would recognize that our epistemology is not really complete, that we need to extend something about how we view the world, right? And that on that level, spirituality is useful. So, for example, that would be, you know, expanding the definition of health beyond mental and social to include spiritual. It would be in enhancing mental health and social support programming, like at the UNHCR, with an aspect of spiritual care. So it would be taking spirituality as an extension of the tools that we already have, of what we're already doing. So that's one thing. The other thing is building relationships with communities, with religious communities, you know, regardless of whether we can find a connection with their spirituality, you know, just to build a relationship with them on the basis of respect, build a partnership with them on a political level. Yeah. So the one of them is epistemological, one of them is political. And I think both is needed, I think. Yeah. So in terms of the securitization, I can't really answer in much detail about that. And maybe I have to think about that a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your question and for your answers. And now, dear colleagues, let us move on the third part of our event, open questions from our listeners. And I would like to give the floor to Andrei Davidov, senior lecturer in cultural studies at Privorsky Research Medical University. Please.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for the interesting lecture. Thank you for your time with us. Yeah, so I have a question about covenantal pluralism that you touched upon in your lecture. So on paper, maybe that's just me, but on paper, it seemed very close to the idea of tolerance. So, but I still feel like you separate the two. Yeah, for you, they're not identical, yet they're not the same. So my question is about this. Basically, how do you separate them? Are there any underlying differences between the two? Yeah, and if so, can we say that in the future, covenantal pluralism will replace the idea of tolerance as the most common approach to treating people worldwide? Yeah, because nowadays, tolerance is worldwide known, right? Covenantal pluralism, not so much. Can you say that one day, somehow, some way, one will replace another? And so, correct me if I'm wrong, you believe that covenantal pluralism is superior to some degree, right, compared to the idea of tolerance? Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you.
Should I respond directly? Yeah, thank you very much for this question. So first of all, the covenantal pluralism is not my theory, right? It was cited in the slides. It was developed by some of the leading scholars and policymakers in the field of religion and development and international relations. So it in some way represents, and it's also quite recent. So it represents their view, not necessarily mine. You know, as an anthropologist, I try to understand how people think.
Okay.
So I don't necessarily think like them. But I can understand quite well how people think that covenantal pluralism is a solution of some kind, and I sympathize with it, and I understand it to a large extent. Now, covenantal pluralism, this theory very clearly states that it does not want to tolerate. It is not about tolerance. According to covenantal pluralism, tolerance is not enough.
Okay.
Tolerance is what we heard before, you know, what we discussed before. It is not really a community. It is not a community of nations. It is not a community of people, because who wants to be tolerated?
Okay.
Do you want to be tolerated in your country? Do you want to be tolerated in your community? Nobody wants to be tolerated. You don't feel respected when you're tolerated. So if you're in a society which is very tolerant, is this really a solution? No, people don't want that. So it is trying to move beyond that. And covenantal pluralism is a way of respecting people in their difference. So you can be whatever you want to be, as long as you don't break the laws. I don't have a problem with you. So, and I respect you in your difference. We don't have to pretend that we like each other. We don't have to pretend that we have the same opinion, but we deeply respect each other. And we deeply respect each other because of a theological thing. It is not because it says so in the law. It is not so because our neighbors think it's a good thing to be. It's because we, for our religious reasons, respect every human being in the way it is. And respect is not tolerance. Respect is acceptance. It is appreciation. It is gratitude. We can be grateful for people who are not the way we are and whom we don't maybe even like how they are. We can still be grateful just for the fact that they are, whatever your theology says, are creation of God or whatever. So yeah, I wanted to underline that difference. It's a core point of departure in covenantal pluralism, is to get away from toleration and interfaith towards respect and multi-faith on the basis of theology, not social convention. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your very important answer. And the next question is from Olga Nagornych, Associated Professor at Department of Social Sciences and Humanities at Privorsky Research Medical University.
Thank you, Nadezhda. Good evening for everybody. Professor, thank you very much for the very interesting topic and very interesting lecture. And my question is, the idea of cooperation between the World Health Organization and religious actors initially caused, if not negative, but at least a mixed reaction within WHO. Who exactly was critical of it and why? Maybe what was done to prevent this partnership? And also, what was general public's response to this? Was there any public resistance to such cooperation? And if so, did it take some radical forms, extreme forms, maybe? I don't know, but it's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I assume you refer to the occurrences in around 2007, 8, 9. There was a backlash, yeah, or a backlash, you could say, a critical reaction. And as far as we have found, that this was by former and current staff members of WHO who got together, formed, you know, maybe an informal kind of group or alliance or something, just a few people who thought the same way and said, you know what, a conference with a church in the buildings of this is just going way too far, you know. Maybe they're even not against cooperating with religious communities, I don't know, but there's somewhere where these people drew a line and then started to some informal lobbying against it, yeah. And it was difficult to find out exactly the details, what happened. There were some key people involved, but I'd like to underline that it's not really helpful to point the finger at, you know, this or that person or this or that event, which kind of ruined the day for everyone. I think it is more like a cautionary note that, you know, it is a very slow process in institutions like the WHO, or other medical institutions where there's a very entrenched ideology. You know, I think it has to be a slow, gradual development. So you can't just go and say, hey, how about covenantal pluralism? How about cosmopietism? How about loyal opposition? How about, you know, we just, you see me as an equal or something? No, there has to be a slow evolution, and it has to start very humbly. You know, it has to maybe start with spirituality in some very specific cases, and then there's maybe building some trust on that. People get to know each other. Maybe there's some evidence being produced showing that it is helpful for whatever is at stake. And through that, it can be built up. And so, yeah, at the beginning, also, there may be some instrumental dynamics, right? I mean, when WHO started with the COVID-19 response at the beginning, so this was now 2 years ago, at the beginning, I remember some of the language I saw was, you know, kind of sounding a bit instrumental, like we need religious communities to amplify, you know, the word was amplify, to amplify our opinions, basically, or our scientific view. And that is not respect. An amplifier is not is not a respect, right? However, that evolved. it evolved, and over the following months and years, there it evolved, I think, a very respectful relationship, which moved beyond this kind of initial instrumentalism. So I think it's a slow, gradual process where there have to be compromises, and if you don't respect that process, then there can be a backlash. Now, the public, as far as I know, there was not involved in the backlash, because, you know, WHO in the end of the day is quite an elitist, if you will, not elitist, but a very elite, you could say, you know, an institution which is, difficult to reach for most people. You know, it's in Geneva, it has its regional offices, but as far as I know, the public was not really involved in any kind of backlash. So, but I'm open to hearing a different point of view on that. Yeah, thank you
very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And dear colleagues, you can give your question now. We are waiting for it. I saw Anatoly.
Yeah, many thanks. My name is Anatoly, State Academic, University for Humanities. I come from the international relations background, and since then my question would go into that direction. So first, do you see any hierarchies between, on the one hand, states, and on the other hand, religion-based, faith-based organizations as part of non-governmental organizations? And second, do you see any hierarchies within non-governmental organizations? Because this trend that you mentioned, that the number of faith-based organizations has been increasing. This trend is the same for the NGOs in general. So, and could also be explained by the fact that the proceedings to register your organizations to receive a consultative status at the ECOSOC have become much easier at the moment. And the final question, so where do you see the role of the World Health Organization in this regard? Is it just a tool for occasional NGOs or occasional powerful faith-based organizations, or a tool for states who support these organizations? Or it's more, since you mentioned the Secretary General, an epistemic community of people with individual beliefs who might influence the agenda of the World Health Organization? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the international relations scholarship is very relevant, of course, and there has been interesting work done in there, also in relation to WHO and spirituality. So there was one article specifically on what this term spirituality, how we can think about that in terms of institutional translation, and making use of some international relations theories on that. So the question there is how are norms generated, and how can spirituality become normative in a way as something which can help translate between secular and religious worlds. So there's some literature on that, but in terms of the hierarchy between, so if I'm correct, you said the hierarchy between NGOs and the UN, and also hierarchies within the NGOs. Is that correct? So
yeah, on the first note, the hierarchy between states and NGOs. So when WHO will be when we will observe this spiritual post-secular move, when the NGOs would unite in their understanding of what a belief is, or whether the states will adopt something intergovernmental, something universal as an agreement. So, but that's just paraphrasing the question.
I think I can answer that in a few general sentences. I think generally saying NGOs in the UN have very little power. You know, I mean, we talk a lot about NGOs and a subset of that, FBOs, but can't forget that they have very little influence, as far as I know. And faith actors in particular, as far as NGOs goes, yes, there are many of them. Yes, they do a lot of work, but I wouldn't say, with some exceptions like the Holy See, are not among the more powerful of NGOs, I would say. Yeah, that is my impression. Now, I think the strength or the influence of NGOs in the United Nations system comes through the norms, through the generation of norms. Because norms are, a part of a culture, right? So I think NGOs bring into the United Nations a cultural values and which can solidify into norms, which then indirectly can influence the UN. So, and this sounds a little bit abstract, but I think that's what's been happening, because through this constant consultation with civil society and with NGOs, people get to know each other, and there are a lot of guidelines and scholarship and so on. There's a lot of conversation being produced, and over time, and of course, people are being trained. New generation of practitioners are being trained by academics, and over time, this accumulates to new norms, which then can establish. So I think it is quite an indirect influence. And if you talk in terms of institutional hierarchy, I think NGOs and in particular religious communities are very low. and WHO as a tool or epistemic community, I think it's a difficult question to answer, which I have to think about some more. I'll get back to you if I can answer that. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. And we have now a last question from priest Roman Tarabrin, please.
Thank you very much for your fascinating lecture. My question is, you mentioned about communications of different religions with WHO during Ebola pandemic. And on the other hand, we have one of the previous questions, how religious leaders didn't communicate with WHO recommendations during COVID. So my question is, do you know something positive effects of such cooperations during this pandemic? So whether WHO consulted with different religion to produce some guidelines in spiritual care or not? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. And just to get on the guidelines for spiritual care, no, there are no guidelines on that. However, there has been a lot of exchange and a major conference which was held by the by EpiWin task force at WHO, and as a way of exchanging experience and sharing their best practices. And so there has been quite a bit of activity. We describe it in the last chapter of the book. But generally speaking, it is easy to get cynical because, as you know, the United Nations does not really have that much power, right? I mean, even the Security Council very rarely really makes a huge impact because of the veto rights. And so the United Nations is based on consensus, right? And it can't really enforce a lot. So a lot of what it does is just, or what these agencies do is share best practices, share guidelines, share formula strategies, provide technical advice, and so on. And the question is always, what difference does it actually make? And so there's a big question mark you can put over all of these activities. What does it in the end actually change? And I think that is something which needs to be researched, right? And there needs to be research showing that this engagement WHO has had with faith actors during COVID-19, that this really has produced results. And we have anecdotal evidence, and we have there was a conference which showed a lot of that anecdotal evidence. But really solid empirical basis needs to be established, right? And very often when this doesn't happen, it's not just in terms of religion, but other policy and recommendations and so on, it gets produced and then more or less forgotten. But, it's very important to follow up and see what difference has it made. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating. So, dear friends, colleagues, we spent 2 exciting hours discussing this absolutely incredibly interesting topic. I would like to thank all of you for your active participation during the last 2 hours, for your questions, and naturally I would like to express my special gratitude and thanks to our lecturer, Fabian. Many thanks for your lecture and for your answers to questions that sometimes sounded a bit too complicated, at least to me, who is a non-specialist, of course. Thank you for your time, for your lecture again. I hope we shall see you again this year or next year when you make some progress with your project. Do consider, please, writing maybe an article for our journal, Modern Contemporary History. The topic is more than relevant, particularly in these our dire circumstances of the last almost 2.5 years. And we'll be happy to consider your manuscript for publication. Friends, once again, thank you all very much for your participation. We're looking forward to seeing you all next month. Please subscribe to our social media pages, the Center for the Study of the History of Religion and Church History of the Institute of World History of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Yes, just stay in touch. We are going to publish the timetable of our February events, probably within the next week or 2 weeks. We shall be delighted to see you all again. So thank you very much, and good luck.